There are moments when an entire lifetime changes in less than an hour. Moments when a person everyone ignores suddenly becomes the only person who matters. Moments when the difference between disaster and survival comes down to a single decision, a single document, a single pair of hands. On a cold Tuesday morning in western Pennsylvania, a steel mill worth more than $200 million stood on the edge of catastrophe. Hundreds of workers had no idea that before the day was over, they would witness a story they would talk about for the rest of their lives. Some would remember the alarms. Some would remember the countdown clock. But most of them would remember a man named Ethan Carter. Because when he first walked through the factory gates that morning, nobody saw a hero. They saw a man they assumed had already lost at life. At exactly 9:17 a.m., the first alarm echoed through the plant. It wasn't the kind of alarm workers could ignore. It wasn't a false warning or a routine maintenance alert. This one made people stop what they were doing and look up. Forklifts slowed. Supervisors grabbed radios. Engineers abandoned their desks. Deep inside the facility, a massive industrial turbine that powered the heart of the operation was shaking with increasing violence. Every vibration sent another warning through the system. Every second pushed the plant closer to a complete shutdown. On the wall of the operations center, a digital countdown appeared beside a flashing red warning. Emergency shutdown in 60 minutes. The room fell silent. Everyone understood what that meant. If the turbine failed completely, production would stop. Contracts would be missed. Millions of dollars would disappear. Jobs could be lost. Years of work could vanish in a single day. Yet while panic spread through the control room, something else was happening on the factory floor. Near the entrance, a thin man carrying a battered red toolbox stepped through the security gate. His jeans were faded. His boots were worn. The toolbox looked older than some of the workers inside the building. He moved quietly, keeping his eyes forward. He wasn't looking for attention. He wasn't expecting a welcome. He was there to do a job. But before he had taken 10 steps into the facility, a voice cut through the noise. Loud, sharp, deliberate. Who let this guy in here? Heads turned immediately. Conversations stopped. Workers looked over railings. Others stepped away from machinery to see what was happening. The man with the toolbox froze for half a second. Not because he was surprised. Because he had heard words like that before. The voice belonged to Frank Dawson, the plant's chief engineer. For nearly 20 years, Frank had been one of the most powerful people in the facility. His reputation was built on confidence. Some called it leadership. Others called it arrogance. Either way, when Frank spoke, people listened. He pointed toward the man with the toolbox and shook his head. This is the mechanic they sent. A few workers laughed. Then a few more joined in. Within seconds, the laughter spread across the floor. The mechanic said nothing. He tightened his grip on the handle of the toolbox and continued walking. But the comments kept coming. Some workers laughed because everyone else was laughing. Others laughed because they genuinely believed the man looked completely out of place. To them, he didn't look like someone capable of solving a crisis that had already defeated entire teams of engineers. What nobody knew was that the man they were mocking had spent more than 20 years repairing machines most people considered impossible to fix. Nobody knew how many factories he had saved. Nobody knew how many emergency calls he had answered in the middle of the night. Nobody knew how many companies were still operating because he had shown up when everyone else had given up. All they saw was a tired face, worn clothes, and a scratched toolbox. And sometimes that is how life works. The people carrying the greatest knowledge are often the people receiving the least respect. As laughter echoed across the factory floor, the countdown clock continued moving. 59 minutes. 58 minutes. 57 minutes. Inside the operations center, engineers were running out of options. Temperature readings continued climbing. Vibration levels were entering dangerous territory. Corporate executives were already joining emergency conference calls. Every minute increased the risk of a complete failure. Yet somewhere in the middle of the panic, the mechanic finally reached the turbine bay. He stopped. He placed the toolbox on the ground. And for the first time that morning, he looked directly at the machine everyone else was afraid of. The workers who had laughed at him couldn't see what he was seeing. They couldn't hear what he was hearing. But within seconds, Ethan Carter noticed something that every engineer in the building had somehow overlooked. Something hidden in plain sight. Something that would eventually lead him to a document nobody was supposed to question. A document connected to decisions made months earlier. decisions that had quietly pushed a $200 million operation toward disaster. And before this day was over, that discovery would expose a truth powerful enough to destroy careers, trigger investigations, and completely change the lives of everyone inside that factory. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The strange thing about that morning wasn't the alarm. It wasn't the countdown clock. And it wasn't even the fact that a $200 million steel operation was hanging by a thread. The strangest part was that the one man who seemed completely calm was also the man everyone else had already dismissed. While engineers rushed between monitors and supervisors barked orders into radios, Ethan Carter stood beside the failing turbine with the same expression he had worn when he first walked through the gate. No panic, no frustration, no attempt to defend himself against the ridicule he had just endured. To anyone watching, it almost looked as if he had expected all of this. And in a way, he had. Because long before Ethan Carter arrived at the plant that morning, he had become familiar with being underestimated. People saw the worn clothes. They saw the old truck. They saw the battered toolbox. What they never saw was the story behind them. As technicians scrambled around the control room, another question quietly began forming among the workers who had laughed at him only minutes earlier. Who exactly was this man? The company had called him in after weeks of failed inspections. Outside consultants had failed. Senior engineers had failed. Specialists with expensive credentials had failed. Yet somehow management had approved bringing in a freelance mechanic nobody seemed to know. Even stranger was the way Frank Dawson reacted the moment Ethan arrived. Most people assumed Frank was simply frustrated because of the crisis. But others noticed something different. Something harder to explain. Frank's reaction didn't look like annoyance. It looked personal. Every time Ethan moved closer to the turbine, Frank seemed to become more uncomfortable. Every time Ethan asked a question, Frank appeared eager to interrupt him. It was subtle, but it was there. And as the countdown clock continued moving, a few workers started noticing it too. Then there was the toolbox. To most people, it looked like a rusty piece of junk that should have been thrown away years ago. The red paint had faded. Scratches covered every surface. The metal corners were dented from decades of use. Yet Ethan never let it leave his side. When he entered the factory, he carried it himself. When security checked him at the gate, he kept one hand on it. And when he approached the turbine, he placed it carefully beside him as though it contained something valuable. Nobody knew that inside that toolbox were tools older than many of the employees working in the plant. Tools that had helped repair machines across multiple states. Tools connected to a story Ethan rarely shared with anyone. But before the day ended, that toolbox would become one of the most important objects in the entire investigation. Meanwhile, several floors above the factory floor, executives were beginning to realize how serious the situation had become. Emergency meetings were taking place inside corporate offices hundreds of miles away. Production forecasts were being revised. Financial analysts were calculating losses by the minute. Every report arriving from the plant painted the same picture. The turbine was approaching a critical point. If it failed completely, the shutdown could cost tens of millions of dollars before the first 24 hours had even passed. Yet hidden among maintenance reports and technical records was a document that almost nobody had looked at closely. It appeared ordinary, routine, easy to overlook. But sometimes the most important truths hide inside the paperwork people stop paying attention to. That document was a purchase order, signed months earlier, filed away without questions, approved without concern. On the surface, it looked no different from thousands of other procurement forms moving through the company every year. Yet that single piece of paper would eventually connect a failing turbine, a desperate executive, and a mechanic everyone had mocked. More importantly, it would reveal why Frank Dawson seemed so determined to keep Ethan Carter away from the machine. Because if Ethan discovered what was hidden inside those records, an entire chain of decisions would come into the light. Decisions that certain people had worked very hard to keep buried. And perhaps the biggest mystery of all had nothing to do with the turbine. It had nothing to do with Frank Dawson. It had nothing to do with corporate executives or factory politics. The biggest mystery was Ethan himself. Why was a man with skills valuable enough to save a major industrial operation living the way he was? Why did his truck look like it had traveled 1,000,000 miles? Why were his clothes worn down to the seams? Why did a man trusted with million-dollar machinery appear to have so little for himself? The answers to those questions stretched far beyond the factory gates. They began long before the alarms sounded, long before the countdown clock appeared, long before Frank Dawson ever heard Ethan Carter's name. To understand what happened inside that factory, we need to go back 24 hours. 24 hours before alarms echoed through the steel mill and long before anyone laughed at him on the factory floor, Ethan Carter was parked behind a small machine repair shop nearly 40 miles away. The sun had not yet risen. The air was cold. The parking lot was empty except for a rusted pickup truck that had seen better decades. Inside the truck sat Ethan, a 42-year-old freelance mechanic whose life looked very different from what most people imagined when they heard the word expert. There were no certificates hanging on office walls, no corporate title, no company vehicle, no expensive watch, no polished image designed to impress strangers. What Ethan had instead was a reputation that traveled quietly through factories, warehouses, power stations, and machine shops across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. When a machine failed and nobody could explain why, someone eventually mentioned his name. When expensive consultants ran out of answers, someone usually knew how to reach him. And when operations worth millions of dollars faced the possibility of shutting down, there was a good chance that Ethan Carter would receive a phone call. His career had never been built on advertisements or social media. It had been built the old-fashioned way. One repair at a time. One recommendation at a time. One impossible problem solved after another. Plant managers shared stories about him. Maintenance supervisors passed his number to one another. Engineers who privately respected his abilities often contacted him when their own solutions failed. Yet despite all of that, Ethan remained largely invisible to the world. Most people never noticed the mechanics who kept things running. They only noticed the executives whose names appeared in annual reports. The irony was that many of those executives depended on men like Ethan every single day without realizing it. The morning before the crisis, Ethan had spent nearly 6 hours repairing a failing hydraulic press inside a small fabrication shop. The job paid less than it should have. Most of his jobs did. Independent mechanics rarely had the luxury of setting prices. They charged what struggling businesses could afford and hoped another call would come before the bills arrived. By noon, his hands were covered in grease. By evening, oil had worked itself deep into the cracks of his skin. No amount of scrubbing ever seemed to remove it completely. Some people saw dirty hands and assumed laziness. Others saw worn clothing and assumed failure. What they never understood was that every stain represented years of experience. Every scar carried a story. Every callus had been earned fixing machines that kept entire businesses alive. The truth was that Ethan's hands told a more accurate story than any resume ever could. The scar across his left thumb came from repairing a conveyor system during a snowstorm. The burn mark near his wrist came from a steel casting operation years earlier. The permanent dark lines in his fingertips were reminders of decades spent handling machinery most people would never dare touch. To the average observer, his hands looked damaged. To people who understood industrial work, they looked experienced. But the average observer was usually louder than the people who understood. That evening, after finishing another long day, Ethan returned to a small workshop he rented on the edge of town. The building wasn't impressive. The roof leaked when it rained. The heater barely worked during winter. The shelves were crowded with parts collected over decades. Yet inside that workshop sat the one possession he valued more than anything else he owned. Resting beneath a faded workbench was a battered red toolbox. The same toolbox that workers would laugh at the following morning. The same toolbox Frank Dawson would dismiss with a glance. The same toolbox Ethan never allowed out of his sight. To understand why, you have to understand where it came from. Long before Ethan became known as a mechanic, his father had spent most of his life working inside steel mills. Robert Carter wasn't famous. He wasn't wealthy. Most people outside his hometown never knew his name. But among the workers who shared factory floors with him, Robert earned a reputation for solving problems others couldn't solve. He believed every machine had a language. He believed every vibration meant something. Every sound meant something. Every failure left clues for anyone patient enough to listen. While other workers rushed to replace parts, Robert preferred understanding why those parts failed in the first place. When Ethan was a boy, he spent weekends following his father through workshops and maintenance yards. While other children played sports, Ethan learned how gears transferred force. He learned how bearings failed. He learned why certain machines lasted decades while others broke after only a few years. More importantly, he learned patience. Robert often told him that most people stopped listening before a machine finished telling its story. At the time, Ethan didn't fully understand what his father meant. Years later, those lessons would become the foundation of everything he knew. The toolbox sitting beneath the workbench had belonged to Robert Carter for nearly 30 years. Every wrench inside had been placed there by his father. Every compartment had a purpose. Every scratch carried history. When Robert passed away unexpectedly, the toolbox became the only inheritance Ethan received. There was no large estate, no financial security, no trust fund, just a collection of tools and decades of knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Most people would have seen an old metal box. Ethan saw his father's entire life preserved in steel and grease. What nobody inside that factory understood the following morning was that the toolbox contained more than tools. It contained methods, techniques, notes, specialized instruments collected over decades. Some of them couldn't be purchased anymore. Others had been modified by Robert himself. Hidden among those tools were solutions that modern engineers rarely considered because modern engineers often depended on computers to tell them what was wrong. Robert had taught Ethan to trust something different. Observation, experience, instinct. The combination had saved countless machines over the years. And as Ethan locked the workshop that evening and prepared for another ordinary day, he had no way of knowing that within 24 hours that battered red toolbox would become the center of one of the most important moments of his life. Because somewhere inside a major steel operation, a machine was failing. Executives were running out of options. A countdown clock was getting closer to zero. And hidden inside that toolbox was something nobody else possessed. What nobody knew was that this toolbox contained something that would soon save an entire factory. The workers who laughed at Ethan Carter that morning believed they understood exactly who he was. In their minds, the story was simple. They saw a tired man with worn clothes, a dented toolbox, and a truck that looked like it belonged in a scrapyard. They assumed he had failed somewhere along the way. They assumed life had passed him by. What they didn't understand was that sometimes the strongest people are carrying burdens so heavy that simply making it through another day becomes an act of courage. The truth about Ethan's life was hidden beneath layers of sacrifice that very few people ever saw. And like many stories of sacrifice, it began with someone he loved. 3 years before the events at the steel mill, Ethan's life looked very different. He lived in a modest home outside Pittsburgh with his wife, Sarah, and their daughter, Emily. The house wasn't large, but it was theirs. The mortgage was manageable. Work was steady. The future felt predictable. Sarah worked part-time at a local library. Emily was finishing high school and dreaming about becoming an engineer. For the first time in years, Ethan felt as though everything was finally moving in the right direction. Then one doctor's appointment changed everything. It started with fatigue. At first, Sarah blamed stress. Then came the pain. Then more tests. Then more appointments. Then the phone call every family fears receiving. Cancer. The words seemed to drain the color from the room. One moment they were discussing summer plans. The next they were discussing treatment options, specialists, and survival rates. Ethan remembered sitting beside Sarah in silence after the diagnosis, both of them staring at paperwork they could barely understand. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. There was nothing to say. Their lives had just divided into 2 chapters, before the diagnosis, and everything that came after. The following months became a blur of hospitals, treatments, prescriptions, consultations, and impossible decisions. Ethan took every job he could find. He worked weekends. He worked nights. He drove across state lines for emergency repairs. Some days he slept only a few hours before getting back on the road. Every dollar mattered. Every invoice mattered. Every payment bought them a little more time. But cancer doesn't care how hard someone works. It doesn't care how many sacrifices a family makes. The bills kept coming, larger than the last, more frequent than the last. By the end of the first year, Ethan had exhausted nearly every savings account he owned. Then came the decisions families never expect to make. First went the vacation fund, then retirement savings, then investments, then personal belongings they never imagined selling. Eventually, Ethan and Sarah faced a choice they had spent years hoping to avoid. They sold the house, the place where they had celebrated birthdays, The place where Emily learned to ride a bicycle. The place filled with photographs, memories, and ordinary moments that suddenly felt priceless. Watching strangers walk through the front door during showings felt like watching pieces of their lives being packed into boxes. But they needed the money. There wasn't another option. Even after selling the house, the financial pressure continued. Treatment costs remained overwhelming. Insurance covered some expenses, but not enough. There were medications, travel expenses, specialist consultations, hospital stays. Every month seemed to introduce a new bill. Ethan stopped counting how many times he stared at invoices late at night while everyone else was asleep. Some nights he sat alone at kitchen tables, motel rooms, and repair shops trying to figure out how to stretch money that simply wasn't there. Then came the day he feared most. Sarah passed away surrounded by family. The battle was over. The pain was gone. But the debt remained. Grief arrived alongside financial reality. Hospital statements continued appearing in the mail. Collection notices followed. The costs of fighting for more time with the person he loved had left behind a burden that seemed impossible to escape. Ethan paid what he could. Then he paid more. Then he paid everything he had. Yet somehow the balance never seemed to disappear. By the time the steel mill crisis arrived, Ethan's life had been reduced to essentials. The truck the workers laughed at wasn't simply transportation. It had become home. After losing the house and exhausting most of his resources, he converted the vehicle into a place where he could sleep between jobs. A small mattress occupied the back. Basic supplies were stored in plastic containers. A few changes of clothes hung from hooks near the rear window. Every morning he folded blankets, organized tools, and prepared for another day, pretending life was more stable than it actually was. Only one person remained unaware of how difficult things had become. His daughter, Emily. Emily Carter was studying mechanical engineering at a respected university. Ever since childhood, she had been fascinated by machines. She inherited her father's curiosity and her grandfather's determination. She spent countless nights studying advanced mathematics, physics, and engineering design. Ethan couldn't have been prouder. Watching her chase a future filled him with purpose during the darkest years of his life. But Emily believed her father was doing better financially than he really was. She knew things had been difficult after her mother's passing, but she didn't know the full truth. She didn't know he was sleeping in his truck. She didn't know how many meals he skipped to save money. She didn't know how often he chose her tuition payment over his own comfort. Every semester, tuition deadlines arrived. And somehow Ethan always found a way to make the payment. Sometimes it meant accepting jobs hundreds of miles away. Sometimes it meant selling equipment he wanted to keep. Sometimes it meant going without things most people considered necessities. But he never missed a payment. Not once. The future Sarah wanted for their daughter remained alive, and Ethan intended to protect it no matter the cost. On the evening before the steel mill called, Ethan sat alone inside the truck reviewing expenses under the glow of a small battery-powered light. Bills were spread across the passenger seat. A nearly empty wallet rested beside them. He studied the numbers for a long time. There wasn't much left. Another missed week of work would create serious problems. Another unexpected expense could push him over the edge. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to wonder how much longer he could keep balancing everything. Then his phone rang. The call came from a steel mill facing a crisis nobody could solve. A failing turbine. Millions of dollars at risk. Engineers out of answers. A final attempt before a potential shutdown. Ethan listened quietly as details were explained. He looked at the fuel gauge in his truck. He looked at the stack of bills beside him. He looked at the toolbox that had belonged to his father. For several seconds, he said nothing. Because the truth is, after everything he had been through, he wasn't sure he had the energy for another impossible problem. And that morning, he almost didn't take the call. When Ethan Carter ended the call, he sat silently for several moments, staring through the windshield of his truck. He could have said no. Most people probably would have. The job was hours away. The situation sounded complicated. The pay wasn't guaranteed. And after everything he had endured during the previous few years, nobody would have blamed him for choosing rest instead. But there was something about the voice on the other end of the phone that stayed with him. It wasn't desperation alone. It was the realization that whoever had called him had already exhausted every other option. By the time people reached Ethan Carter, it usually meant the easy solutions had already failed. The steel mill itself was one of the largest industrial operations in the region. Covering hundreds of acres and employing more than 1,200 workers, it had become an economic lifeline for entire communities. Families depended on it. Local businesses depended on it. Suppliers, contractors, truck drivers, and countless others relied on its continued operation. The facility produced specialized steel used in major infrastructure projects across the country. Every day the plant operated, millions of dollars moved through its systems. Every day it remained productive, thousands of people benefited from its success. But every industrial operation has a weak point. For this facility, that weak point was a single machine. At the center of the plant sat the master turbine. Most visitors never noticed it. It wasn't displayed proudly for tours. It didn't appear in marketing brochures. Yet the turbine was arguably the most important piece of equipment in the entire operation. It helped power critical production systems throughout the facility. If the turbine stopped, major sections of the plant would stop with it. If it failed completely, the consequences could be catastrophic. That was exactly the situation management now faced. The first signs of trouble had appeared nearly 3 weeks earlier. Initially, the issue seemed minor. Maintenance crews noticed unusual vibration readings. Nothing dramatic. Nothing immediately alarming. Industrial equipment occasionally produced strange readings. Experienced operators monitored the situation and expected the problem to resolve itself during routine maintenance. Instead, the vibrations became worse. Then temperatures started rising. Then strange sounds began appearing during operation. Every attempt to identify the root cause produced more questions than answers. Internal engineering teams worked around the clock. They inspected bearings. They reviewed maintenance histories. They analyzed performance data. They replaced components they believed might be responsible. Nothing worked. Each repair appeared successful for a short period before symptoms returned. Some engineers suspected alignment issues. Others suspected wear inside critical assemblies. Meetings stretched late into the night. Reports filled conference tables. Yet despite their efforts, the turbine continued moving closer to failure. As the situation deteriorated, management brought in outside consultants. These weren't inexperienced technicians. They were highly paid specialists with impressive credentials and decades of combined experience. They arrived carrying sophisticated diagnostic equipment and extensive recommendations. Plant executives felt relieved. Surely experts of this caliber would solve the mystery. They didn't. Days passed. Then more days. Every theory collapsed under scrutiny. Every repair attempt failed to produce lasting results. The consultants eventually reached the same frustrating conclusion as everyone else. Something was wrong. Nobody knew exactly what. As pressure mounted, conversations inside the plant became increasingly tense. Production schedules were affected. Executives demanded answers. Financial projections began changing. The possibility of a shutdown transformed from a distant concern into a genuine threat. Every day the turbine remained unstable increased the risk of disaster. And throughout all of it, one man remained at the center of every major decision. His name was Wade Prescott. For nearly 2 decades, Wade had served as the facility's chief engineer. His reputation inside the company was enormous. Younger engineers admired him. Executives trusted him. Supervisors respected him. When Wade entered a room, people listened. He spoke with confidence. He carried himself with authority. And after years of successful projects, few employees questioned his judgment. On paper, Wade looked exactly like the kind of leader a major industrial operation wanted overseeing critical systems. He was experienced, connected, influential, powerful. But reputations often hide things. The workers who laughed at Ethan Carter that morning believed Wade Prescott represented competence and leadership. They believed he was trying to save the plant. They believed he was the smartest person in the room. Everyone trusted Wade. They were about to find out they shouldn't have. As the crisis deepened, corporate headquarters became increasingly involved. Executives demanded daily updates. Emergency conference calls became routine. Financial analysts calculated potential losses under multiple shutdown scenarios. Every report arriving from the facility painted a more troubling picture than the one before it. The turbine's condition continued deteriorating. Time was running out. The night before Ethan arrived, a final emergency meeting was held. Plant leadership, engineering teams, and corporate executives reviewed the latest data. Nobody liked what they saw. Vibration levels were approaching dangerous thresholds. Temperature readings continued climbing. Repair attempts had failed. Consultants had failed. Engineering teams had failed. The facility was running out of options, running out of time, and running out of excuses. The next morning, shortly before Ethan Carter walked through the factory gates carrying his father's toolbox, a final message arrived from corporate headquarters. It was short, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. If the turbine could not be stabilized, emergency shutdown procedures would begin. No exceptions, no extensions, no second chances. The countdown clock was activated. 60 minutes remained. And somewhere inside that steel mill, 1,200 jobs, $200 million in operations, and the future of an entire facility were now racing against time. By the time Ethan Carter stepped through the factory gates, the atmosphere inside the plant had changed completely. The earlier confidence was gone. In its place was tension. Supervisors moved quickly between departments. Engineers studied screens filled with alarming data. Radios crackled constantly. Every few minutes, someone checked the countdown clock. Every person in the building understood that the situation was becoming more serious with each passing minute. Yet despite everything that was happening, the arrival of a single mechanic somehow became the center of attention. Ethan entered carrying the red toolbox that had belonged to his father. He didn't arrive with an entourage. He didn't arrive making promises. He didn't arrive asking for recognition. He simply walked through the gate and headed toward the turbine bay. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it became the beginning of something else. Several workers noticed him immediately. Some exchanged amused glances. Others quietly shook their heads. To them, Ethan didn't look like the answer to a multi-million-dollar problem. He looked like someone struggling to keep his own life together. His clothes showed signs of years of hard work. His boots were worn. The toolbox appeared decades old. In a facility filled with engineers, managers, consultants, and specialists, Ethan seemed completely out of place. Then Frank Dawson spoke. The words echoed loudly enough for workers across the floor to hear. So that's the miracle worker they brought in? A few people laughed. Then a few more. Within seconds, the laughter spread. Someone leaned over a railing and made a comment about Ethan's toolbox looking older than the turbine itself. Another worker joked that corporate must have run out of real experts. More laughter followed. Ethan heard every word. He kept walking. Years earlier, those comments might have bothered him. They might have followed him around for the rest of the day. But life had already taught him a difficult lesson. People often create stories about strangers long before they learn the truth about them. Sometimes they do it because they feel superior. Sometimes because they are afraid. Sometimes because it is easier to laugh at someone than to understand them. Security personnel, standing near the entrance, watched the exchange unfold. They didn't intervene. From their perspective, it was simply another uncomfortable moment inside a workplace under pressure. Nobody realized they were witnessing the beginning of a story that would soon spread far beyond the factory walls. Frank Dawson wasn't finished. As Ethan approached the main production floor, Frank stepped forward. The chief engineer folded his arms and looked Ethan up and down. The expression on his face wasn't curiosity. It wasn't skepticism. It was contempt. Frank had spent weeks fighting a problem he couldn't solve. Consultants had come and gone. Meetings had produced nothing. Pressure from corporate was growing. The last thing he wanted was an outsider walking into the facility and succeeding where his own department had failed. So tell me, Frank said loudly enough for nearby workers to hear, what exactly makes you think you can fix something an entire engineering team couldn't? Several employees looked toward Ethan. The room became quiet. People expected an argument. They expected defensiveness, maybe even anger. Instead, Ethan simply looked at the turbine in the distance. Then he looked back at Frank. I don't know yet, he said calmly. That was all. No speech. No attempt to prove himself. No effort to win anyone over. Just 4 words. For a moment, the response seemed to irritate Frank even more. Because confidence is easy to challenge. Arrogance is easy to attack. But quiet certainty is harder to dismiss. Without another word, Ethan continued toward the turbine bay. The laughter slowly faded behind him. Some workers returned to their stations. Others remained watching. A few exchanged skeptical looks. None of them understood that the man they had just mocked had spent years solving problems that looked impossible. None of them understood that Ethan was already studying details everyone else had overlooked. And none of them understood that the next few minutes would change everything. When Ethan finally reached the turbine, He set the toolbox carefully on the floor beside him. The machine continued vibrating. Temperature readings continued rising. The countdown clock continued moving. 54 minutes remained. Then Ethan did something surprisingly simple. He didn't start taking equipment apart. He didn't rush toward a solution. He didn't touch a single tool. Instead, he stood silently beside the machine, listening, watching, observing, the way his father had taught him years earlier. For several moments, he said nothing at all. Then he slowly knelt beside the red toolbox. The metal latches clicked open. Workers watching from nearby platforms leaned forward. Engineers exchanged confused looks. Frank Dawson watched from a distance. And for the first time all morning, a hint of concern appeared on his face. Because while everyone else had been focused on the machine itself, Ethan's attention was drifting somewhere else entirely. Toward maintenance records, toward service histories, toward decisions made months before the alarms ever sounded. What he discovered moments later would change everything. By the time Ethan Carter pulled the maintenance records onto the small workstation near the turbine bay, the noise around him had faded into the background. The laughter from earlier had stopped, replaced by uneasy observation. Workers who had mocked him only minutes before were now watching in silence. Something about the way he worked made it hard to dismiss him completely. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't guessing. He was reading every line as if each detail mattered more than anything else happening in the building. The turbine continued its unstable rhythm behind him, a deep mechanical vibration that could be felt through the floor. Warning indicators still flashed in the distance. The countdown clock still reminded everyone of the limited time left. But Ethan Carter didn't look at the clock. His attention was locked onto a series of maintenance logs and procurement records pulled from the plant's internal system. Page after page, entry after entry, routine inspections, component replacements, alignment adjustments. At first, everything looked normal. Standard industrial documentation. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. But Ethan had spent enough years inside complex mechanical systems to know that problems were rarely obvious at the surface. They were hidden in details most people skipped over without a second thought. Then he stopped. His eyes paused on a single entry. A purchase order logged 5 months earlier. He leaned closer. Read it again. Then a third time. The document showed a replacement coupling assembly installed during a scheduled maintenance window. On its own, it looked routine. Approved part. Approved installation. Approved documentation. But something about it didn't match the reality of what he was seeing in the turbine readings behind him. He shifted his focus back and forth between the record and the machine. Then back to the record again. Slowly, the inconsistency became clear. The part listed in the system was not rated for the operating conditions of this turbine. Not even close. It was a cheaper industrial substitute. Lower durability. Lower tolerance. Lower performance threshold. A component designed for lighter mechanical systems, not a high-load industrial turbine operating at extreme speed and continuous pressure. Ethan didn't speak at first. He just stared at the line. Because experienced mechanics don't rush to conclusions when they find something like this. They confirm. They verify. They double-check the context. They make sure what they're seeing is real before they allow the implication to form. He turned slightly and looked at the turbine again. The vibration pattern suddenly made more sense. The wear pattern. The instability. The gradual breakdown over weeks instead of a sudden failure. It all pointed back to the same source. The wrong part. Installed at the wrong time. Approved through official channels. Ethan scrolled further down the document. That was when he saw the signature. Frank Dawson, Chief Engineer. For a moment, the sound of the factory seemed to disappear completely in his mind. Not because it actually stopped, but because his attention had narrowed so sharply that everything else lost importance. One line, one name, one approval tied directly to the part that was now compromising an entire multi-million-dollar system. Behind him, workers began to notice the change in his posture. The stillness, the focus, the way his expression had shifted from analysis to realization. Frank Dawson, standing a few meters away, watched closely now. His arms were no longer crossed with confidence. There was a subtle tension in his stance, though he hadn't moved. Ethan didn't accuse anyone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't call anyone out. Not yet. Instead, he slowly closed the maintenance file, then opened it again, as if confirming to himself that the truth didn't change just because it was inconvenient. A few workers exchanged glances. Something about the moment felt different. The earlier mockery was gone, replaced by uncertainty. Ethan finally spoke, but his voice remained calm, measured, controlled. "These parts weren't meant for this system," he said quietly. Frank Dawson immediately responded. They were approved through standard procurement channels. But even as he said it, his tone lacked the certainty it had earlier. Ethan didn't look at him. He was still reading, still connecting details that had been buried inside months of documentation, still following the trail that no one else had questioned. Then he said it, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly enough for the nearest workers to hear. The machine wasn't the real problem. He paused. Every sound in the turbine bay seemed to tighten around those words. Then he looked up slightly, toward the direction of management and engineering oversight. Someone inside the factory was. The moment Ethan Carter spoke those words, the atmosphere inside the factory changed again, but this time it wasn't confusion or curiosity. It was pressure, a weight that seemed to settle over everyone at once. Workers who had been watching from a distance now stood completely still. Engineers stopped typing. Even the constant industrial noise of the plant seemed less dominant against the rising urgency of the turbine alarms. The countdown display continued ticking forward. 50 minutes remaining. Then 49. Then 48. Each second felt heavier than the last. Ethan turned back toward the turbine, his focus now fully locked on the system in front of him. The maintenance logs were no longer just records. They were evidence of a chain of decisions that had slowly pushed the machine beyond its safe operating limits. He could see it clearly now. The instability wasn't random. It wasn't sudden failure. It was the result of long-term strain caused by a component that should never have been installed in the first place. The alarm tone shifted again, higher in pitch, more urgent. Technicians nearby checked readings with growing concern. Temperature levels were climbing faster than before. Vibration readings were now entering dangerous thresholds. Every indicator confirmed the same thing. The turbine was moving closer to critical failure. Ethan didn't hesitate. He moved quickly toward the housing panel, pulling tools from the red toolbox with controlled precision. Each motion was deliberate, not rushed, but efficient. Years of experience had taught him that panic slows repairs. Focus speeds them up. But he was no longer working alone. Frank Dawson stepped in. At first, it was subtle. A few words over the radio, then instructions to nearby workers, then direct interference. All non-essential personnel away from the turbine bay, Frank ordered. Some workers hesitated. Others obeyed immediately. Security personnel began moving through the area, signaling people to step back. The space around the turbine started to clear, but not completely. A few workers remained frozen in place, unsure whether to leave or stay. Ethan didn't look up. He kept working. Frank's voice grew sharper. "This area is restricted. Everyone out except authorized engineering staff." That word, authorized, landed differently now than it had earlier in the day. Because now people were starting to question who was actually authorized to understand what was happening. The turbine shook again, harder this time. A deep mechanical vibration that traveled through the floor and into the surrounding structure. One of the support indicators flashed red. The system wasn't just unstable anymore. It was approaching critical failure conditions. Ethan paused for the first time, not because he was unsure, but because he had found it. The true point of failure. It wasn't just the coupling. It wasn't just the misalignment. It was deeper inside the assembly where stress from the wrong-rated component had gradually damaged a critical alignment interface. A failure point that would not appear in basic diagnostics. A problem hidden beneath layers of normal readings until the system reached a threshold it could no longer survive. He exhaled slowly. "This is worse than we thought," he said quietly. Behind him, Frank Dawson watched with a tight expression. For the first time, he wasn't speaking. He was listening. Then another alarm sounded. A sharper alert. System integrity warning. The countdown timer changed again. 45 minutes. Ethan immediately returned to work, now faster, more focused. He needed to stabilize the assembly before the damage progressed further. But as soon as he reached for the next tool, movement approached from behind. "Security." 2 guards stepped closer. Then another order came through the radio. "Frank Dawson again. Remove him from the turbine bay if he refuses to comply." A ripple went through the workers nearby. Some looked at Frank. Others looked at Ethan. No one spoke. The tension was no longer just about machinery. It was about control. about who was allowed to act when everything was on the line. Ethan finally looked up, just for a moment. No anger, no reaction, just awareness. Then he returned his attention to the turbine and continued working. Because at that point, something had become absolutely clear. He wasn't just trying to fix a machine anymore. He was racing against something far less forgiving. Time itself. The voiceover of the moment felt almost heavier than the alarms. Now Ethan Carter wasn't just fighting a machine. He was fighting time. The turbine bay had reached a point where silence no longer felt possible, yet somehow the tension inside the factory made even the alarms feel distant. Every worker present could sense that something irreversible was about to happen, not just to the machine, but to the people inside the room. Ethan Carter stood beside the maintenance terminal with the printed procurement records spread across the metal surface. His hands moved steadily as he aligned the documents with the digital logs on the screen. He wasn't guessing anymore. He wasn't searching. He was connecting what had already been hidden in plain sight. Then he stopped. His finger rested on one entry. Then another. Then another. Each one linked to the same pattern. Same component type. Same supplier channel. Same approval path. But more importantly, the same signature. Frank Dawson, Chief Engineer. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't call for attention. He simply turned the screen slightly so the nearest workers could see. "This isn't a single mistake," he said quietly. "This is a pattern." A few workers leaned closer. Frank Dawson stepped forward immediately. "You're out of line. Those purchases were necessary to keep production running under budget constraints." But his voice didn't carry the same authority it once did. Ethan didn't respond to the deflection. Instead, he pulled up another document. Then another, cross-referencing timestamps, procurement approvals, and vendor invoices. And that's when the structure of it became undeniable. The parts installed inside the turbine weren't just underrated. They were consistently sourced through a single supplier that had no legitimate industrial track record. The pricing structure didn't match market standards. The procurement timing didn't align with maintenance schedules. And the financial records showed something even more alarming. Funds allocated for standard-grade industrial components had been partially diverted. Not missing, not lost, redirected. A subtle margin on every order. Repeated over months. Small enough to avoid immediate detection. Large enough to accumulate into something significant. Ethan turned the screen fully toward the room. "This isn't just a faulty installation," he said. "These parts were approved knowing they were wrong for the system." The words hit the room differently now. Workers who had mocked him earlier were no longer speaking. Some looked at each other in confusion. Others looked at the documents with growing realization. The story they thought they understood was shifting in real time. Frank Dawson's expression tightened. "You don't understand procurement decisions," he said sharply. "You're a field mechanic." Ethan finally looked at him directly. "And I know what happens when a shaft rated for 3,000 revolutions per minute is forced to run at 3,450, he replied. "I also know what happens when someone signs off on it anyway." The room went still. Then Ethan pointed at the signature on the procurement sheet. It was clear now. Repeated. Consistent. Unmistakable. Wade Prescott, Chief Engineer. From across the turbine bay, heads slowly began to turn. Workers who had been following Frank now looked toward Wade. Wade stood near the control area, his posture rigid, his face pale but controlled. At first, he didn't move. He didn't speak. But the moment the documents were fully visible, something in the room changed. The laughter from earlier was gone. The confidence from management was gone. Even security hesitated. Because now the situation wasn't about a malfunctioning turbine. It was about decisions made before the turbine ever started failing. Ethan continued calmly. "Every replacement part that weakened this system traces back to these approvals," he said. "Every failure point. Every vibration increase. Every warning you ignored." He paused, then added one final line. "And every dollar difference between what was approved and what was installed disappears into the same pattern." That was the moment everything shifted. Not gradually. Immediately. Workers stepped back. A supervisor whispered something under his breath. One of the security guards turned his head slowly toward Wade. Then another. Frank Dawson no longer spoke. He simply stared. Because the implication had become impossible to avoid. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't oversight. This was intentional. Wade finally moved, stepping forward as if to interrupt, but the room reacted before he could speak. The attention had already shifted away from the machine away from the repair, away from the countdown. Now all eyes were on him. The man who had been trusted. The man who had signed the decisions. The man whose name appeared on every line that led to this moment. The atmosphere inside the factory changed completely. Because in a matter of seconds, the crisis had a new origin and a new target. There was no celebration when Ethan Carter turned back toward the turbine. No relief. No applause. Only urgency. Because even though the truth had been exposed, the machine itself was still seconds away from failure. The alarms continued screaming through the facility. The countdown timer still moved forward. And every worker standing inside that bay understood something very clearly now. Knowing the cause didn't stop the collapse. Fixing it did. Ethan stepped into position beside the turbine housing, his movements sharper now, but still controlled. The red toolbox sat open on the floor, every tool arranged exactly where his father had taught him decades earlier. Nothing digital. Nothing automated. Just steel, precision, and experience. Frank Dawson didn't speak anymore. Wade Prescott didn't either. Security remained still, no longer certain where authority actually stood. The room had shifted, and now it was waiting. Ethan began the repair sequence. He didn't start with replacement parts. He didn't start with software diagnostics. He started with what couldn't be faked. Touch, sound, vibration. He placed his hand on the turbine casing and closed his eyes for a brief moment, reading the machine the way most engineers read a screen. The vibration pattern told him exactly where the stress had concentrated. Years of strain from the wrong-rated coupling had shifted load pressure into a section of the shaft assembly that was now dangerously unstable. He opened his eyes, moved immediately. The first tool came out of the box, then the second, then the third, each motion precise, each adjustment deliberate. Workers nearby watched in silence, unable to look away. Because what they were seeing wasn't modern engineering in the way they expected. It was something older, something built on repetition, memory, and instinct. Ethan adjusted the alignment interface manually, using a method most modern technicians had never been trained to recognize. No automated calibration system, no digital override, just mechanical correction guided by feel and experience. He tightened one section, paused, listened, adjusted again. The turbine responded with a shift in vibration, subtle but noticeable. Then came the critical step, the coupling reseating. If it failed here, the entire system would collapse. Ethan didn't rush. He stabilized his breathing, then applied torque in a controlled sequence, not all at once, but gradually, distributing pressure evenly across the assembly. His father's method, one that wasn't in official manuals anymore because modern systems had replaced it with automated torque calibration. But automation didn't matter here. Experience did. Behind him, one worker whispered without realizing it. He's actually doing it. Another didn't respond. No one laughed anymore. No one doubted. Even Frank Dawson remained silent, watching the process unfold with an expression that had shifted from authority to realization. Ethan moved to the final adjustment point. The dial indicator readouts were still unstable. The temperature warning still active. The countdown still running. Less than 10 minutes remained. He made the final correction, held it, then locked it in place. A deep mechanical sound echoed through the turbine bay as the system settled into alignment. Ethan stepped back immediately. No celebration, no pause, just distance. Restart the system, he said calmly. A technician hesitated, then followed the instruction. The control panel came alive. The turbine began to spin down briefly, then stabilize as it prepared for controlled restart. The entire factory seemed to hold its breath. The restart sequence initiated. Low rumble, then gradual acceleration. 1,000 revolutions per minute, 2,000 revolutions per minute, 3,000 revolutions per minute, 3,450 revolutions per minute. Full operational speed. For a moment, nothing changed. The alarms still blinked. The tension still remained. The numbers on the display hesitated, as if uncertain whether to recover or collapse. Then it began. Temperature readings stopped climbing. Vibration levels started dropping. Stabilization indicators flickered from red to amber, then from amber to green. One by one, systems that had been failing for hours began returning to normal. The countdown timer slowed, then stopped. A confirmation alert flashed across the control system. Emergency shutdown canceled. The turbine had stabilized. The plant was safe. Inside the bay, there was no immediate reaction. No shouting. No cheering. Just silence. Heavy. Unbelieving. Workers stared at the screens, then at the machine, then at Ethan Carter standing beside the open toolbox. Because they had just watched something they weren't prepared for. A system that multiple engineering teams had failed to fix. A problem that consultants had walked away from. A failure that was minutes away from shutting down a $200 million operation. Had been solved. By the man they had mocked. The man they tried to remove. The man they underestimated. Ethan didn't look at anyone. He simply closed the toolbox. And for the first time all day, the factory wasn't on the edge of disaster. It was still. The silence inside the factory didn't last because nothing was happening. It lasted because everyone was trying to understand what had just happened. The turbine was stable. The alarms were gone. The countdown had stopped. But the weight of the last hour was still sitting in the room like something no one knew how to put down. Security finally moved in. Not toward Ethan Carter, but toward Wade Prescott. At first, Wade didn't resist. He just stood there, staring at the control screens as if waiting for them to change back. As if reality might undo itself if he didn't look away. But it didn't. The logs were already saved. The system records had already been copied. The decisions he made were no longer contained inside the factory. They were documented, investigated, exposed. Frank Dawson said nothing as Wade was escorted out. No defense. No argument. Just silence that carried the weight of everything that had been discovered. Within minutes, corporate leadership had already been notified. Within hours, an internal investigation would be launched. And within days, everything tied to the procurement chain, the approvals, and the turbine failure would be reviewed line by line. But inside the plant, none of that mattered yet. Because all attention slowly returned to Ethan Carter. He was still standing near the turbine, hands resting on the edge of the red toolbox. Exhaustion was written into every part of him. But he didn't move like someone who expected praise. He moved like someone who had simply finished work that needed to be done. A plant manager stepped forward cautiously. Then another. Then Frank Dawson followed, slower than before, no longer carrying the same authority he had earlier in the day. Finally, someone from corporate spoke over the intercom, their voice steady but different now. Ethan Carter, they said, we would like to formally offer you a leadership position within the facilities engineering division. Full authority. Full oversight. Anything you need. A few workers exchanged looks. This was the moment people expected celebration. Recognition. Reward. After everything that had happened, it seemed like the natural conclusion. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He looked down at the toolbox, then slowly straightened up. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. I have one request, he said. The room quieted instantly. Even the people who thought they knew what was coming leaned in slightly. A bonus. A promotion. Back pay. Something financial. Something expected. Ethan looked up, and what he said next changed the tone of the entire moment. Pay my wife's medical debt. No explanation followed. No additional detail. Just the request. Simple. Direct. Real. The room went completely still. Not because it was strange, but because it wasn't. Because in that moment, after everything he had done, after saving a factory worth hundreds of millions of dollars, after preventing 1,200 people from losing their jobs, Ethan Carter hadn't asked for wealth. He hadn't asked for status. He hadn't asked for recognition. He had asked for something that had followed him through every step of his life. Peace. A plant supervisor lowered his eyes. Frank Dawson looked away completely. Even the corporate voice on the intercom didn't respond immediately. Because there was nothing to argue with. Nothing to negotiate. Nothing to reduce. Just a truth that sat heavier than anything else in the room. Finally, the response came. It will be done. Ethan nodded once. That was all. No smile. No celebration. Just acceptance. As if that was the only outcome that ever truly mattered. A quiet voiceover seemed to settle over the moment. The man who saved a $200 million factory didn't ask for a bonus. He asked for peace. Ethan turned slightly, looking across the factory floor one last time. The same place that had laughed at him. The same place that had tried to remove him. The same place that now couldn't meet his eyes. Then he spoke one final time, almost as if reminding no one in particular. Sometimes the strongest people aren't the loudest. He paused. They're the ones carrying burdens nobody can see. And with that, he closed the red toolbox. The story didn't end with applause. It ended with understanding.